Hello everyone, welcome to Insights with Kusum Wijetilleke and Vidushan Premathiratne. The forum is mainly organized to answer certain pressing questions that the general public would have and need answers. So joining me today, we have our co-moderator, Kusum Wijetilleke, and also joining me are two eminent speakers who are best at answering mainly these questions that we have put forward today. We have Senior Professor H.D. Karunaratne, who's the former Dean of the Faculty of Management and Finance, University of Colombo, and who is also the Chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies. And also joining him is Deshal, and he's the Director of Veritaire Research. He's also served as advisor to several ministers in the past and governments, and also serves in various roles in his capacity. So in order to begin things with, so I'll start off with Professor Yu. So I think one of the key pressing issues that is answered today, is Sri Lanka bankrupt?
No, I think, because if economy is bankrupt, we cannot function like now. Sri Lankan economy has not been a strong performing economy during last 5 or 6 years, or even last 30 years or 70 years, we were not performing very well. If the structure of Sri Lankan economy, we need to understand first and most important thing, our main source of income has been the $7 billion that was the migrant remittances, and $5 billion from the 5 to 5.5 from the garment sector, and again nearly 4.5 billion from the tourism sector. And when we concern like economies with highly financial crisis faced economies, or when we concern like some other countries, I don't see that we have a very strong economy in Sri Lanka. So for the time being, we know that we had to face two major issues apart from the economic crisis, because for a long period we were downward trending economy in terms of economic growth and other variables. There we had the Easter attack and the COVID. So due to these two, the economy went into negative side. So I think now we have come back to work. When we are back to work, we see that there is a positive trend. The best example is the exports. Exports are switching out, and the other thing now, migrant workers again started going, and they're trying to get, we know that basically last 10 years or 15 years, if you take Sri Lanka, every month about 15,000 to 20,000 Sri Lankan youth went for working in abroad. But from 2020 March, we could not send our workers abroad. So that there was a huge crowd. Now they want to go to other countries. You can see it in front of the Immigration Bureau. There's a huge queue. Why? That is because that last, I think around 16 months, they could not go into working abroad. Last 10 years, 15 years, if you take Sri Lankan economy, mainly mobilized the remittances. Based on remittances, Sri Lanka was operating. And of course, we know the tourism. Of course, we were close to 3 million tourists, and the level of income was about close to $5 billion. That became to zero almost. So these are the hitting points for Sri Lankan economy. But with the regaining work after COVID, I think that we can come back like the earlier situation.
So Deshal, what do you think we can do in terms of improving revenue, but also attracting FDI? What hasn't been done before in terms of FDI?
Yeah, thanks Kusum, and thanks for inviting me to the show today. Yeah, you're right in saying that the upcoming budget is going to be one of the most consequential budgets in Sri Lanka's recent past. So let me give a little bit of background as to why that is leading up to your question. Now, Sri Lanka has had fiscal problems for a while, right? When I say fiscal problems, I mean significant, substantial budget deficits. But with the onset of the COVID pandemic in 2020, along with some policy changes to tax policy, Sri Lanka's budget deficit increased quite significantly in 2020. So we went to a 14% budget deficit, which is around twice the average that we've had for the last decade, and significantly higher than, say, the global median in terms of budget deficits. And this is one factor, or I would say the crucial factor, that has resulted in Sri Lanka's credit ratings being downgraded, and then consequentially losing access to global capital markets. Now, why this is important is the fact that Sri Lanka does have significant amounts of external debt that matures in the coming 5 years. Over the next 12 months, between September 2021 and August 2022, Sri Lanka has about $6.7 billion of external debt that is maturing. And at the same time, our reserve level is quite low. I think Professor alluded to some of the reasons behind that, the decline in tourism revenues, decline in recent months in remittances as well. Now, given this low reserve coverage and high level of liabilities, it becomes crucial that Sri Lanka is able to regain access to global capital markets to be able to refinance the capital portion of the maturing debt. That's what most emerging countries would do in this kind of situation. But to regain access to global capital markets, we have to re-rate our credit ratings. So we are CCC levels right now from the major agencies. We need to upgrade that by at least 2 notches. In order to be able to regain access to global capital markets, to be able to then refinance our maturities. Now, the budget is going to play a crucial role in addressing this credit rating issue. As I said, one of the key factors that determined the change in our ratings was the fact that our budget deficits increased very substantially. Now, we have to bring down this deficit from 14% to a level of around 5% in the next coming years. Now, that also cannot be done overnight because, again, we know that Sri Lanka is still recovering from the pandemic, and so any the decline or the reduction of this budget deficit also has to be done in a calibrated, gradual manner. So, how do we tackle the budget deficit, right? So that's leading up to your question. Now, Sri Lanka is one of the biggest factors, the problems that we have in our fiscal management is the fact that government revenues are very low by global standards. So in 2020, we had government revenue of around 9.2% of GDP, which is the lowest in our region and one of the lowest in the world as well. So clearly one of the factors that is required is to enhance government revenue. At the same time, there is also the other option is to reduce government expenditure. But if you look at the structure of Sri Lanka's government spending, a lot of our spending is non-discretionary. So we have significant payments for our interest cost, around 6.5% of GDP. Our salaries and pension bills comes to another 6.5% of GDP. Welfare payments for things like samurdhi, for payments to people with disabilities and so on, nutrition supplements. All of those are also non-discretionary payments, which is very difficult to roll back, particularly in this context. So really the answer is, how do we enhance revenue? Now, if you look at Sri Lanka's government revenue, 90% is tax revenue, 10% is non-tax. So the heavy lifting has to come from the tax side. So as I said, in a pandemic situation, in a economic recovery situation, it's not very straightforward to raise taxes in the short term as well. So what I would suggest is that we could focus on measures in the immediate term to address the tax base. So I'll give you 2 examples of how that can be done. One is if you take interest income. We previously had a withholding tax on interest income, where the tax is collected by the banking system and remitted directly to the Internal Revenue Department. And that happens automatically. With the changes in the latter part of 2019, the WHT was removed. So now the individuals have to now self-declare. So obviously from administration perspective, that is a lot more cumbersome and there's a lot more leakage. Similarly with PAYE. Again, it was previously the employers that would remit the tax to the department. Now it is the declarant himself. So just those 2 measures are just 2 examples where without even changing rates, you can have a significant impact on tax collection simply by restoring PAYE and withholding tax. So I think those are the kind of measures we can start with. But of course, rates would also have to be increased parallelly in a gradual, measured manner.
And would you want to touch on FDI because it seems that FDI, one of the problems, I think, even during the JR period, was that there were a lot of restrictions on repatriation of profits, dividends. I think there are even limits on expatriate labor. When we see a lot of the Chinese projects, especially that happen in Sri Lanka, there's a lot of Chinese labor that comes in. Now, obviously, to make ourselves attractive, these might be some of the things you throw out. But there has to be a line that you draw, a break-even point, where you say, okay, if we give all these, then what is the actual benefit we get? So around that prism, could you analyze how we might go about FDI? And Professor Karunaratne as well, if you could take up on that after the show.
Yeah, so let me start. On FDI also, I think one of the important factors in the investment decision, whether it's portfolio investment, whether it's investment in FDI, still the overall macro situation is critical, right? So there again, one of the first things that an investor would look at is the credit rating of a country. For a triple-C country, it is clear that the risks on the macroeconomic side are quite substantial. So investors would be concerned about, what is the outlook for the currency, what is the outlook for interest rates. So again, I think that the fundamental issue that we need to address as a priority in Sri Lanka is to re-rate our credit ratings by at least 2 notches. I think that will certainly help on the FDI side as well. But of course, there are structural issues that we need to address, right? You alluded to labor. And there are certainly in Sri Lanka, we have limitations in the availability of large volumes of skilled labor. There is certainly skilled labor available, but it's typically niche.
Skilled or unskilled?
Skilled.
But Chinese
Both,
labor is
yeah.
unskilled, generally,
Exactly.
that I've seen.
So it applies at both spectrums. So at the high levels and also at the low, so in in construction and sectors like construction, you have limited availability as well. So you have problems at both ends. So certainly there is a case for having some degree of flexibility on labor availability as well. And beyond that, utilities. Sri Lanka's energy costs are among the highest in the region. So all of these factors will affect the investment decision. And it's important that we address these supply side factors in order to really become attractive as a source of as a destination for FDI.
Okay, before I move into FDI, I will come to little bit on this tax issue. Actually, what Deshal articulated, it's very good. The issue in Sri Lankan budget, what I see, is long-term and fundamental. The issue start from not the tax rates and tax structure. Issue start with how do we charge the taxes. Because we do not have good database and we do not have grassroots level information. And without having good information, we cannot mobilize the taxation. So when I compare with Japan, for example, I was there about 13 years. So entirely different set of information we used to collect here taxes. I don't think that with the current structure of the inland revenue, we can do that. We need to restructure inland revenue and we need to go back to grassroots and particularly from the Gram Sevaka level, we need to collect all information for the entire country. Based on information, we have to go for income tax, and of course, the tax is not just increasing taxes for those who are paying tax or those who are working in public sector. Increasing tax is not the large amount. But now the tax base in Sri Lanka is the pay slip or bank interest rate. But that should not be. In further, the inland revenue should really identify what are the basis for get the taxes. And there, of course, I think there are a lot of the areas where we need to make informal economy into formal and take the taxes. Now, we have allowed informal economy to grow, and as much as possible, then we say that our tax income is less. So the basic is coming from the information, tax basis, and the making informal into formalization, and tax leakages and corruption. Those areas we have to address with respect to taxation. Then we can get higher income. As correctly Deshal pointed out, in the region we are lowest tax rate, and in the when we compare with our per capita income level, lowest tax rate. This very important issue. We need to fundamentally change the economic structure. The other one, of course, with respect to FDI, I have a different view, where the FDI, we are always thinking about the large scale, large projects. and where the foreigners will come here and invest, provide the jobs and bring the profit, something like that. But I think there are many other ways of going for FDI, like for example, the linking small and medium-sized enterprises into other countries. SMEs, say for example, Chinese SMEs and Japanese SMEs, Korean SMEs, linking to Sri Lankan SMEs. We can get many benefits from that. Expect to go for huge infrastructure development and like Singapore type of development. That will never happen unless we keep our house in order. Our house we can't keep in order without having the common round table and national policies. Where when the political parties come into power, they of course try to get the FDI. Then when they are in opposition, they oppose the all FDI. So this is a political issue. So we need to ultimately, what I believe, that there should be a more debated and policy making institute like economic planning agency in Japan or somewhere, where the economic matters address in fundamentals, using from the fundamentals, rather than just we are putting one policy and one instrument, whether we check that whether it is good or bad, when one instrument coming from one budget. For example, I can remember somewhere in 2016 budget that government gave a lot of benefits for electric vehicles, and then in the next budget it was reversed. So the thing that you see, the budgets, if you clearly study in history, there are many new events coming, but I can remember there was SME Bank. What happened to SME Bank now? So the just putting small things may not work according to this problem. We have economic problems, not economic questions, because questions you can have yes, no answers, but economic problems you have to go deeper and understand how economy works and what kind of structural changes are essential.
And also, I think, Professor, you raised a very important question. You raised actually some good answers on actually mitigating this revenue shortfall. But I would address them as a bit more long term in building a database. We've been trying it for a while and so on. But in the short run, now I think what we've heard in the media, what the government has actually communicated is there will be something like a wealth tax or a COVID tax for about a year, which can actually bridge that 900 billion or something of that sorts. So if such a scheme, or based on your understanding, if such is imposed, do you think it will apply to the top line, like something like the NBT being reintroduced and so on? Because as we've seen from 19 to 20, there's a 40% reduction or 30% reduction in VAT. Then income taxes have dropped. So where do you think such measures will be implemented? Would they look at corporates on the top line or on the bottom line, or basically looking at reducing the slab for individuals in terms of taxations and so on? Where do you think it will apply?
Deshal, it's very difficult to guess. But anyway, that we believe that there will be an additional tax, wealth tax or COVID tax, because we had earlier NDB, now we don't have. But meanwhile, we know that when it comes to the latter 2019, the economy was in normal situation. So people thought that reducing VAT, because there was a long-term claim that small firms and startup people, they said that the tax is very high for them. So reducing this VAT, they were trying to increase the number of employees or number of enterprises and something like that. The other thing that if the VAT rate was 14 today, I think the inflation will be more higher than. The VAT, actually increasing VAT is not the solution for long-term income revenue. Even advanced countries, they announce 10 years ahead when they increase the expenditure taxes. They never do expenditure taxes overnight. So the thing that when we target the tourism sector, when we target some exporters, if the local inflation is very high, then actually we cannot go for expected objectives. So the best thing is not from the VAT, but from the income tax. So that is the, I think, best way to. Earlier there was was a suggestion to reduce it 80% to 60%, but still it is 80%. So the overall thing, we need to reduce that to 60%.
Professor, I think a good question is now when it comes to actually bridging this budget deficit, what the government has resorted was printing money. I think that's how the notion has come in, like what we call in nice notion, it's called domestic financing and so on. So do you think is that a viable strategy according to the so-called modern monetary theory that has come about, or where do you see that ending? Because even recently we have seen still money printing continues and so on. So where do you think that?
Yeah, the issue is that, since the 1978, the Sri Lanka has been printing money and filled the budget deficit with local budget filling. So we can see, for example, 1978 to even today, there were about 10% inflation rate in 1980s, exactly. That inflation rate was backed by this money printing. But money printing is of course there, but that is last resort. If they cannot go for foreign loans, but they do that, they print the money. But according to the modern monetary theory, or the new arguments coming, that the printed money of course is not coming to the ordinary level people, that goes to somewhere else. So therefore printing money is no harm. But the country like Sri Lanka, is the problem is I feel that inflation is coming due to supply shortage. The supply shocks. We have supply limitations. The goods what we produce is not sufficient to people's demand, and we are importing, that is also not sufficient. And the top of that, what we had was, in a crisis situation, people go for expectations. They have fear, what will happen next week, what will happen following week. So therefore those who buy 5 kilo of rice go for 10 kilo of rice. So then the rice demand will be double. Like that, we know that what happened, the entire last year import bill is same as the first 6 month import bill of this country. So because that unexpected in terms of I think the consumers, they wanted to acquire more and more goods. On the other hand, even the sellers, they wanted to bring more things and keep it hide and sell it for very higher price. So this I think capitalism doesn't work here. Why the main problem is people don't understand what is market, and when they get the fear, they panic. So there are a lot of panic decisions. We can see many panic decisions of individuals, society, as well as government, and every people taken panic decisions due to this COVID situation. So we need to concern this, we need to monitor this, we need to clear this. So for that, I always argue that we need a good database. For example, Sri Lanka is one of the countries lacking input-output table. IO table. Actually, if there is an IO table, we can monitor entire country, where it is produced, who's consuming, which part consuming, which part is producing. And the item wise, number wise, we can do. The advanced countries, they can do many research based on the input-output table, where are the inputs coming out. So in data-wise also, in economics, we have a lot of problems. We cannot go for CG modeling, actual type of modeling, because the problem is data. We believe Sri Lanka has data, but actually we don't have micro-level data.
I just want to, because you mentioned capitalism, Professor Karunaratne, and I'd also like to ask Deshal this, before we get into any more questions on the Sri Lankan economy, since you're both economists, it may be a little bit of a strange question in terms of the dichotomy around capitalism, socialism. I don't think that exists. But in terms of classical economics, if I can start with you, Professor Karunaratne, are you more on the Adam Smith side, or are you more on the Keynesian side? I mean, do you...
No, actually, this is very difficult question. Yeah. What is the fundamental question in today's world? Whether the free market work, or we allow free market, and are we following market-friendly approaches? So that's the best thing. No? So everybody now, because if you take the East Asian development, entirely how the Korea developed, Japan developed, that's a market-friendly approach. Let the market to work and guide the market and get the support from the market to go to government goal. So that is what we have to do. So there's no today calling the socialism or capitalism, what you said. But as economists, what we have to see that are we empowering markets? That is essential. And are we using markets to achieve the entire nation goals?
Deshal, how do you feel about this? Are you a fan of the Washington Consensus? Do you buy the neoliberal critique? Do you think we're moving away from the Washington Consensus, or does Sri Lanka still need to find its market?
So I think these labels can be unhelpful sometimes. I think Professor touched on the correct question is, it's really a question of whether markets work. So I would think that we need to understand that markets are a very effective tool in terms of allocation of resources, but we must also understand where markets are imperfect. So especially in developing countries, you have significant imperfections in terms of access, in terms of inequality of information, and a number of other factors that make that cause hindrances in markets. So the role of the state comes in terms of ensuring that there is a robust safety net, so that those who are disadvantaged do have some kind of fallback in terms of income support and other factors, and also ensuring that there is true competition. A lot of the kind of situations where we see markets failing is because you have imperfect competition. You have either oligopolistic situations or monopolistic situations where the market is not really able to function properly. That results in prices being different to what a truly market-determined price should be. So I would think that there is certainly a role for the state in order to understand where markets fall short and to address those shortfalls. If I could also just touch on what we spoke about earlier in terms of the debate on money printing and so on. So I think timing is very important, right? So during the pandemic, it was very important that that monetary policy and fiscal policy were able to work together to provide some kind of support and stimulus for the economy. And that was not just in Sri Lanka, you saw that in many countries around the world. And Sri Lanka, as we know, we entered the pandemic with an already compromised fiscal situation. So monetary policy had to take an additional role there. So the whole thing of, deficit financing, money printing, whatever you want to call it, was to ensure that markets are provided with sufficient liquidity, that interest rates are kept at a reasonably low level, to ensure that the economy doesn't collapse in that situation. Now, what is important is to ensure that you also have a robust exit strategy from that. So you need to be able to take the stimulus away at the right time in order to prevent overheating taking place. So once the economy starts to recover, once we see economic activity coming back, once we see private credit starting to grow again, that is the cue for slowly withdrawing the stimulus. So I think in Sri Lanka's case, we are probably a little bit late in terms of pulling back on the monetary stimulus, but that has been happening in the last few months. So interest rates have been allowed to go up. The treasury bill and bond auctions have been better subscribed. So there is the requirement for the central bank to kind of build up its balance sheet by buying treasury bills has now diminished to some extent. There's still a lot of liquidity being provided through overnight markets, and so that the issues are still there to some extent, but it appears that there is now steps towards an exit strategy from this monetary stimulus in the form of money printing or deficit financing.
WPLR is still ticking up. It's at over 7.6
That's right.
today.
It's gone up by 200 basis points in the last 8 weeks.
If I can just ask one more thing, since we're on this topic, as an economist, forget the political aspects, price controls.
Yeah.
They don't work. Can they work? What is the alternative? If you remove a price control overnight, you have a problem like what's happened. How would you ease in? Is there a transition tool? Is there an instrument you can use? Would you like to?
So I think the problem with price controls is that it typically does lead to shortages, right? And it's exactly what has happened in Sri Lanka, and that is, it's very basic economics. You fix your price below the market clearing rate, you're going to have demand exceeding supply. That's it's not rocket science, and that is what has manifested over here as well. So I think price controls don't really work as a long-term solution to the problem that you're trying to solve. The problem that you're trying to solve is that we understand that there are large communities that are disadvantaged in the country who are unable to afford essential commodities at certain prices. But the solution to that is not to have the entire economy paying a subsidized price, because that typically does lead to shortages. So I would think the more kind of fundamental longer-term solution is that the market price is paid by all, but households that are disadvantaged are provided a cash transfer cash subsidy to enable them to have the income support to be able to afford this. Now, the difficulty with enabling a kind of cash transfer system is what Professor mentioned earlier, the lack of information. We don't have the right level of database to be able to properly target such transfers as well. So that is a fundamental issue. So you have to have a robust system of targeting to be able to make sure that people who are deserving, are disadvantaged, have the necessary income support to be able to afford essential commodities. I think that's the longer term solution instead of price controls.
If I may just interject, Professor Karunaratne, before you answer the same question, what he's essentially saying is that means testing is complicated, right? So he also mentioned direct cash payments. Some economists and maybe commentators in the West have discussed a universal basic income, but on the back end, at the end of the year, if you've submitted a tax return, you get taxed above and beyond because you've received this cash subsidy. Is that something that can work in Sri Lanka? Because it seems that means testing, it needs a lot of infrastructure, a lot of data, improving the IRD, all of that. Whereas if you can do a direct cash stimulus, which has happened in even very capitalist countries, market-friendly countries like the US, under right-wing governments, is that something that we can consider and maybe tax back those people who didn't really need it at the end of the year?
I think it's a very complicated issue where we have been failing last 70 years to identify the real poor. We could not identify real poor up to now. Anytime the poor is growing, while the economic growth rate is faster, per capita income is going. So the issue is the information. I always highlight that. And the other, the more than the cash transfer is one way to address. There are alternative ways in economics all the time. And more than that, what I want to say that we have to stimulate the producers. Producers and consumers are dissatisfied in this country now. The producers, particularly if you go to the essential goods, agricultural products, the farmers, particularly there are many things we have to do with respect to production of agricultural goods and services to ensure their higher level of income. And on the other hand, I think the consumers that we need to give the subsidies or we need to keep the price low for these consumption items. For how we can keep it by producing more essential goods and services. The issue is that starting from the fundamentals, the farmers, they do not have any kind of marketing system. They do not have any kind of transportation system. Say, for example, in Japan, it has done by the farmers' cooperatives. Farmers are producing and they do value addition. Finally, they supply to the final consumers up to that level. There's no intermediate people. Now, the country like Sri Lanka, we know the producers are discouraged and the consumers are also discouraged because there is an intermediate way. The problem is we don't have systems. We don't have transportation system. We don't have, particularly for goods and services production, supply. Supply, when we talk all the time, we believe that we have to give cash transfers for consumers. But that more than that, I think that we need to increase the quantity we produce as well as the maximum benefit we have to give to the producer. Then if the producer getting the maximum benefit, that will come to a lower price in the market. So that's how the free market system work. So the subsidies must give to producers, and not only subsidies, where are the systems. We have to make systems change for conducive to the production economy. The producer is discouraged, particularly in agriculture sector. So over the long run, there are many actions we have to take on there. So it's not one mechanism, but we need to articulate very carefully about how to address these issues.
So I think I'll start off with Deshal. I think since we talked on the topic of supply shocks, if you one key reason for certain supply shocks that are happening right now, especially on gas, then you take essentials such as sugar, then we have cement and so forth, so on, is the shortfall in foreign exchange, and that's what is causing these so-called abnormal price hikes. So in most layman terms, how do we explain to people why has Sri Lanka actually fallen into this state? why don't we have money to buy our essentials, and how severe it would get. So I'll start with Deshal, and maybe Professor can
Sure.
answer.
Yeah, so I think if you look at what's happening with commodities, we have two factors. So globally as well, you're seeing sharp increases in prices in many commodities. You've seen that with oil very visibly going up from $40 a barrel of crude last year to around 80 Brent these days. Natural gas has gone up significantly in price, number of food commodities. So globally what you're seeing is that the recovery from COVID with vaccinations, demand has picked up very fast and supply has not really been able to keep track, right? So it's again not a surprise, it's fairly predictable from an economic perspective. So Sri Lanka is a price taker in global markets for many of these, but our problems are compounded, as you quite rightly said, due to the forex situation as well. So at the beginning we spoke about the fact that reserves have come down to very low levels, and with the liabilities that need to be paid as well, the government basically has had to face a choice between whether we need to settle our global creditors or do we keep our reserves to ensure that we're able to import what is required. So that is the kind of the challenge that we have faced. It really comes down to this significant crunch between our gross official reserves and the liabilities that we have. And with that, effectively, the availability of dollars in the market is low. Dollar liquidity is very tight. So banks also don't have the wherewithal to be able to open LCs as and when they would choose. So in Sri Lanka, these two factors together have resulted in this in the shortfall of availability in these essential commodities. And on top of that, of course, the price controls. The fact that we've had the domestic retail price being set below a market clearing rate again compounds the issue, and it results in further shortages. Now, with the revision of prices in recent weeks, there should be some level of easing of some of those domestic market shortfalls. But what we're seeing is global prices are still increasing at a rapid rate, right? So for gas, for instance, even with the changes in prices domestically, global prices have still gone beyond that. So I think what I would suggest is that it's probably good to have a system where you reflect the fundamental price of those commodities in your domestic market, but find some way of compensating the consumer in that sense.
Yes, actually, it's very good answer where we are now in. I can add another two factors for that. One is because we know we had to face economic crisis. When we are facing economic crisis, as I discussed earlier also, consumers are predictions and producers are predicting. So therefore, in future uncertainties, because of future uncertainties, demand goes up. Supply, they try to keep it at stock and sell for next month. So that mechanism also happening in a crisis situation. Another important reason coming from the, I think, long term, our grassroots level, some policies what we have taken. For example, we have been excessively depending on gas. The gas issue we would have actually overcome if we started long ago this solar as a different system. Now I know, for example, in Sri Lanka, if we can go for solar, say average family, how much the electricity consumption, that if they can have say 1 million allocate for solar, for 25 years they can self-sufficient with the gas and solar both, the gas and electricity both. And there are a lot of benefits with going to solar. But instead of going to solar power or some other wind power or alternative sources, we went into gas, because gas is imported and coal is imported. So if you see for example, last month I saw one day, our entire energy, the electricity production, 38% is only the local sources. And the rest of that 70% of the more than that coming from the imported coal and the gas turbine, diesel and that. So as a result, we are excessively depending on the imported sources, the raw materials. That has been a fundamental question in the economy. So this has come because of these reasons, because the shortage of dollars and other we can see. So I think it's a very important thing to think over our vision, the long run, how we address these issues for 30 years, 40 years. Now, for example, I always take many examples from Japan. Nowadays, they are testing a driverless vehicle. That maybe after 50 years, but they are now testing. There are driverless vehicles now. So they are in that mentality. After 50 years, what we should do, we have to think now. So that with respect to Sri Lankan policymakers, they were gradually shifted into gas and coal and imported raw materials. So we cannot go for that. And the solar is the best method I think we can do.
Yes, but say in the short run, I think that's where the issue is. How do we get past the situation today? So that's where the government also has gone into the 100% conversion. It moved gradually from 10%, 25%, then 100% export conversion. And also what you hear quite prominently is we are waiting for tourism to solve the data. So in terms of short-term measures, what we want to see is like what the people want to hear is, when are we going to come out of this? When are we going to have the luxury of importing our own vehicles? Even exporters, importers, now we know so much of exporters are paying demurrages and so on in terms of clearing their goods, in terms of clearing raw materials. Now the cement shortfall is highly attributed towards the lack of their inability to order materials to clear it. So in terms of the short run, rather than saying tourism or any other things, what is the measures? Is there any measure?
No, actually, it is the outcome of long-term activities. As I told that during last 10 years, if you see our trade deficit about 3 billion, 2 to 3 billion financed by the loans, what we are taking from other countries. So that when we finance the trade deficit by taking loans, this will happen one day. It is obvious. So that's why we know now the maturity dates have come to closer, and this role we can't go. We went into importing more and more goods by using loans and other ways. So these are not sustainable. But the issue is that we need to address how we can get rid of long run. The problem in this country, I think many people, they don't like to sacrifice anything. So then they need another additional things. So that doesn't work in economics. In economics fundamentals, we call no free lunch. No free lunch. If you sacrifice something, you can get it something.
Just make a trade-off.
Trade-off, yeah.
Deshal, I'd like to ask you on the burning question these days regarding the IMF. There's a very clear separation. One side is very pro-IMF, the other side is not considering the IMF, or so we've been told. I think the economist Joseph Stiglitz came to Sri Lanka during the Hapalnia time, if I remember right. And I think that was also the time you were attached to the finance ministry. Given the Stiglitz critique of the IMF and how it might compromise aggregate growth, sort of tie the government's hands behind their back regarding government spending, how do you see this? Is there an alternative? I mean, is there some way we can increase government revenue, maybe curtail our spending to some degree, but keep infrastructure projects going and avoid the IMF? Or are we now at the point where we just don't have a choice, that we have to go to the IMF?
Yeah, so again, it comes down to the fundamental question we spoke about at the beginning in terms of, so I don't think the question should be whether Sri Lanka needs the IMF or not. The question is, what can we do to re-rate our credit ratings, right? So to regain access to global capital markets. Now, a lot of that comes down to confidence, right? So global capital markets will look at in the upcoming budget, Sri Lanka does set about trying to address its fiscal constraints. What markets will look at is, okay, is this a credible promise? Is this something that the government will actually live up to? So the role of the IMF is really in terms of anchoring some credibility to a country's economic plans, right? Because the market will know that if the IMF is there, then there is effectively a guarantor that this program is going to go ahead because if the IMF steps out, then there is a signal that it's going off track. So the role of the IMF is not so much in terms of the volume of money that he can bring in, right? So if you look at the 2016 program, the credit facility was just about $1.5 billion, which is very low compared to the actual liabilities that we have. But what it does is it does unlock that confidence. It's a signal. That signaling factor is quite important. Now, for a country like Sri Lanka, the signaling factor is important because we have unfortunately not had a very good track record in terms of credibility. So I'll give you one example of that. We have a piece of legislation called the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, and that by law sets out what our budget deficit should be, what our public debt should be, what government guarantee should be. This law was enacted in 2003. Now, for the most part, this law has been observed in the breach. So according to this law, since 2006, Sri Lanka should not have had a budget deficit of more than 5%. Every year since 2006, we've had a budget deficit more than 5%. So we don't do a very good job of signaling credibility ourselves. So we have to resort to external anchors of credibility, and that's why we have gone to the IMF 16 times in the past.
Right. Also, we started off, we mentioned the skilled labor shortages. There's also a lot of, even in the Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor, there was a lot of conversation about improving innovation and all of these things. And in terms of foreign direct investment, ease of doing business, I'd like to look at, for example, investment in education, which we've historically seen at very low levels compared to peer countries. And also, we rank very low in basic things like enforcing a contract in the event of a breach. It takes sometimes 3 to 4 times as long as it would in an advanced economy like Singapore, for instance. So are there things that this government can do immediately in terms of, let's say, innovation isn't going to pop up suddenly. It has to be a culture, it has to be something in the education system, certainly not what our current education system, public education system is producing. And on the other side, how can we make the judiciary a little more efficient? Is there anything this government can do given all the constraints it has? Because unless you solve these things, no one's going to come here and do business if you can't enforce your contract, within a space of a year. You're just not going to get anything done. So do you think there's anything we can expect from the government going forward in these areas?
So I think certainly in terms of education, you're spot on in terms of the fact that our spending levels are a lot lower than our peers. And I think Sri Lanka has kind of rested on the fact that we've had very good basic indicators in education, right? Literacy, enrollment at that childhood level, basic stuff like that. But we don't do very well in terms of some of the other key outcomes, right? In terms of failure rates at science and maths at the advanced level, getting higher education, tertiary education, acceptance levels are again quite low. The scalability there is weak. So there is no doubt that there needs to be higher spending on education. Now, someone would ask that, look, we spoke earlier about the fact that our fiscal situation is so constrained. How are you going to increase spending on education? But there again, I think it's a question of allocation. So we have situations where we have in terms of expenditure. Our allocation is often is often suboptimal. So I'll give you an example. We recruited about 160,000 graduates and low-skilled staff into the government sector in 2020, and that costs about 65 billion rupees per year. So if there is a will, there is always a way to find money. But I think it's a question of getting the priorities right. And I think education should be elevated in terms of going to the highest level. With regard to the judiciary, I do understand that there has been quite a bit of effort in terms of addressing some of these key legislative requirements. I'm not privy to the the exact specifics of that, but I do understand that there has been a lot of attention towards that, addressing both the court systems, digitization of courts, and so on as well. So there is a ongoing effort towards addressing that. That is again one of those long-term solutions. It's not going to give you results in 2022 or 2023, but it's certainly important, and I'm certainly glad that there is effort put into that area.
Thank you very much to the both of you for being here. And tomorrow, I guess we'll have a lot more answers in terms of what the budget's going to come out with. I hope we can take it to the next level in the next coming year, but tourist arrivals have been slow to come up, so I guess by about January, February, we'll have a better idea on what our reserves might be going to Q2 2021. So once again, thank you, both of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.